Che's parting words followed Do-hyun home in a way the vote itself hadn't. Someone with real resources took an interest in what's under it. He turned that sentence over so many times in the 3 days since the council session that Han had finally, half joking, threatened to confiscate the ledger until he stopped writing the same margin note in 6 different handwritings. Who zoned this specific plot as a discard zone? Why here? Why me? It wasn't paranoia. It was the one habit his class had never let him break. The reflex to ask what a decision actually cost, and who decided it was worth paying. A city didn't accidentally forget to survey a resource deposit this valuable. Someone had looked directly at it, decades ago, and chosen burial over development. That was a decision. Decisions had names attached to them, somewhere, in a file, on a shelf, in a building with a records clerk who'd never once expected anyone from Reclamation Zone 6 to come asking. So he did the only thing his class had ever known how to do when a problem got too big to fight. He filed a request.
"You want archive access," Beck said, standing at the charter office table 3 days later, looking at the request form like it was a small, polite bomb. "Municipal zoning archive, pre-fracture records included." "You said it yourself," Do-hyun said. "Someone signed off on burying this deposit instead of developing it. I want to know who, and I want to know why, before whoever it is decides my district's growth is a problem they'd rather solve than explain." Beck studied him a long moment. The particular look Do-hyun was starting to recognize, of a career bureaucrat weighing exactly how many rules he was about to bend for a man who kept turning out to be right about things nobody official wanted to admit. "Pre-fracture zoning archives," he said slowly, "haven't been requested by anyone outside the council in longer than I've held this post. I can get you in. I can't promise you'll like what's in there. Half of it hasn't been properly catalogued since before I was born." "I've read worse paperwork," Do-hyun said. "I filed my own exile." The municipal archive turned out to be less a records room and more a forgotten wing of the city. 3 sublevels beneath the council building, shelves stretching into lantern-lit dark, the air thick with the particular dry, papery smell of documents nobody had opened in longer than anyone currently living could account for. Beck led the way with a lantern and a set of keys he clearly wasn't supposed to have unsupervised access to. Mira came for the maps. Han came because, as he put it, someone competent needs to actually organize whatever we find, and it's not going to be either of you. So-yeon came without explanation, which by now Do-hyun understood was simply how she said, "This matters to me too," out loud. The first find was almost disappointing in its ordinariness. A thin, deliberately vague zoning file from 31 years ago. A single signature at the bottom, worn nearly illegible, reclassifying Sector 6, formerly Agricultural Reserve, as a discard zone, for reasons listed only as resource instability, containment impractical. No name attached beyond an office stamp. A dead end, dressed up as an answer. "That's not a decision," So-yeon said, reading over Han's shoulder. "That's a decision being hidden. Nobody writes a reason that vague unless they specifically don't want the real one on record." It was Mira who found the thread that actually unraveled everything. Not in the zoning shelves at all, but in an adjacent section of badly organized cartography records, chasing an older boundary line she'd noticed didn't match any city map from the last 2 centuries. "This can't be right," she said, unrolling a brittle, water-stained map across the nearest table, lantern light catching a border drawn in ink so faded it was barely more than a suggestion. "This is dated before the fracture, long before. And it shows territory boundaries for something called—" She squinted at the archaic script. "The Steward's Compact. Do-hyun. This isn't a village. This is almost the entire continent under a single, unified claim." Do-hyun stared at the map for a long moment, feeling the particular cold water shock of a fact refusing to fit anywhere it was supposed to. That's not possible. Everyone knows pre-fracture history was just farming villages. No classes, no rifts, nothing organized enough to hold territory like that.
That's what we were taught, So-yeon said quietly, and something in her voice had gone very careful. Frostspire teaches the same history everyone else does. Simple world, then the fracture, then classes, then towers. I never once questioned it. Why would I? Nobody questions the story everyone agrees on. Beck, who had gone very still at the edge of the lantern light, finally spoke. Because someone worked very hard to make sure everyone agreed on it, he said. I've spent 19 years administering classification law in this city. I know every statute, every precedent, every clause of the doctrine that decides who eats and who doesn't based on what their gate reading says. He looked at the map, then at Do-hyun, and something behind his careful, bureaucratic composure cracked just slightly. I have never once, in 19 years, seen a single official document explain why the doctrine is built the way it's built, only what it requires. I always assumed that was an oversight. I don't think it was anymore. They found the rest of it over the following 2 nights. Piece by fragmentary piece, the way real history, as opposed to the clean version everyone gets taught, usually surfaces. Not as a single revelation, but as a slow accumulation of things that shouldn't have been hidden this carefully unless someone had worked deliberately for a very long time to make sure they stayed that way. Here is what the Ashfall archive gave up. Over 2 nights and more lantern oil than Han wanted to account for in the ledger. Centuries before the fracture, long enough ago that even the surviving fragments disagreed on exactly how long, the world had cracked open once before. Historians who'd once studied it, in the handful of surviving texts that used the term at all, called it the sundering. Rifts tore open, monsters poured through, and for the first time in recorded memory, ordinary people began manifesting classes through gates that appeared, unexplained, in every settlement across the continent, exactly as it would happen again 6 years ago, exactly as though the world remembered how to do this and simply hadn't needed to for a very long time. In the chaos that followed the sundering, most of the continent fractured into competing warlord city-states, each built around whichever combat class hero had survived long enough to claim territory. Most of them collapsed within a generation, the way fear-built kingdoms usually do. One did not. A single administrator class, the records gave only one name for them over and over, in every fragment that mentioned this era at all, organized a settlement, not around a hero's sword, but around food distribution, shared infrastructure, and the simple, unglamorous work of making sure nobody starved while everyone else's kingdoms burned each other down over territory. The records called this person the first steward, Do-hyun. Within a single generation, Do-hyun's settlement had grown, purely through management rather than conquest, into something the fragmented war kingdoms around it couldn't match with any amount of individual combat strength. The Stewards' Compact, a unified civilization spanning nearly the entire continent, built the same way Do-hyun had built Ashfall, one ordinance and one fed citizen at a time, except with centuries more room to grow before anyone powerful enough to stop it had realized what was happening. That's us, Han said quietly, staring at the map. That's exactly what we're doing. Except they got there first, and got there bigger. They got there first, Beck said. And then they got erased, which is the part that should worry you considerably more than the part where they succeeded. The last document Beck pulled that second night wasn't a zoning file or a map. It was a single surviving page. Water-damaged, the handwriting hurried, unmistakably personal in a way nothing else in the archive had been. Folded inside a records box that had, according to its own cataloging tag, been sealed and reclassified as non-historical over a century ago, which, in an archive this size, functionally meant buried on purpose. So-yeon read it aloud, once, in a voice that got quieter with every line. They came at midwinter, when the compact's harvest stores were fullest and its guard rotations thinnest. Frostspire's ice sealing every gate before dawn, so nothing inside could flee and nothing outside could warn the capital in time. Stormhold broke the outer defense line before the sun was fully up. Galewatch had sold them every weakness weeks earlier, for a price history will not record. Umbral Reach found the first steward in the granary, unarmed, distributing the last of the winter stores to a line of frightened citizens, and did what Umbral Reach has always done best. Cinder Peak burned what was left standing, until the capital's name became, forever after, simply what fell from the sky the day it happened. Dawnspire's priests arrived last, once the fighting was done, to write the version of this that history would actually keep. That no administrator had ever truly mattered, that Haeryun's compact had been a fragile anomaly bound to collapse on its own, that the natural order of a broken world was combat strength, and always would be. I helped them write it. I am ashamed of that, more than anything else I did that winter. If anyone ever reads this, know that the compact did not fail. It was murdered by 6 houses who could not stand to lose to a class of people they had already decided didn't matter. And then it was erased, twice. Once by the sword, once by the pen. Nobody spoke for a long time after she finished. The long winter, Beck said finally, voice unsteady in a way Do-hyun had never once heard from him. It's referenced twice, obliquely, in 2 completely unrelated statute revisions from around the same period. I always assumed it was a season, a famine maybe. I never once connected it to... He stopped and looked at the page again, and something in his expression suggested a much older, quieter horror settling into place. 6 houses, frost, storm, wind, flame, shadow, light. Do-hyun. Those aren't historical names. No, Soo-yeon said, very quietly, staring at nothing. They're the 6 towers. They're what Frostspire became. They sat with that for a while, the lantern burning low, before Do-hyun finally asked the question he'd been circling since the moment Mira unrolled that first map. The capital, he said. The one Cinder Peak burned. Does the document say where it stood? So-yeon didn't need to check the page again. She'd clearly already done the math, in the same silent, precise way she did everything, and was simply waiting for someone else to say it out loud first. It says the capital's name became what fell from the sky that day, she said. Ash. It fell as ash. For weeks, they wrote. Enough to bury the wreckage under drifts taller than the walls that used to stand there. She looked up, and Do-hyun watched the exact moment the last piece locked into place behind her eyes, at the same instant it locked into place behind his own. Nobody names a garbage dump after a poetic accident, Do-hyun. Somebody, centuries ago, started calling that stretch of ruined ground the Ashfall, because that's genuinely, literally what it was. And the name just outlived the reason. Long enough that by the time this city needed somewhere to throw away the people it didn't want, the Ashfall Yard was just a name on an old survey nobody left alive remembered the true weight of. Han made a small, strangled sound that wasn't quite a laugh. We didn't build a settlement on top of a garbage dump, he said. We built it on top of a capital city. The aetheryte vein isn't a resource deposit, it's It's what's left of whatever powered the compact itself, So-yeon finished. Centuries of dormant capacity, sealed under ash and scrap, because 6 towers made very sure nobody would ever be foolish enough, or unlucky enough, to build there again. With that for a long moment, feeling the specific, vertiginous weight of learning that the worst place in the entire city, the place he'd been thrown away to die in, had once been the beating heart of the single greatest thing an administrator class had ever built, and that everyone responsible for burying that fact was still, in one form or another, sitting exactly where they'd always sat, running the world exactly the way they'd rewritten it to be run. System, he murmured, mostly to himself, mostly bitter. Administrator class instances currently active worldwide. 1. He looked up. I always thought that notification meant I was rare. I think it might mean I'm a recurrence. The thing they buried finally growing back through the ash, in exactly the one spot they never expected anyone to plant anything again. He found he wasn't as frightened by that thought as he probably should have been. Beck was the one who finally organized what they now understood into something usable, because organizing frightening things into usable categories was, in the end, exactly what his own class had always been for. There are 4 broad categories every gate sorts a person into, he said, laying it out the way he must have explained it to 100 confused new citizens over 19 years, except this time with the weight of finally understanding why the categories were shaped the way they were. Combat classes. Warriors, rangers, mages, paladins. Everything built around directly engaging rift spawn. Support classes. Healers, buffers, scouts, enchanters. Anything that makes a combat class more effective without fighting itself. Manufacturing classes. Artificers, smiths, alchemists, engineers. Anyone who produces the gear and supplies the whole system runs on. And administrative classes. He paused. Stewards, cartographers, quartermasters, diplomats, archivists, administrators, the category that organizes everyone else. And the only one of the 4 the current ration formula assigns 0 verified value to, by law, on purpose, because verified combat output was written centuries ago by people who had every reason in the world to make sure it never counted people like you at all. So it's not an oversight, Do-hyun said slowly. It's the doctrine working exactly as designed. It's the doctrine working exactly as designed, Beck agreed. 6 towers wrote the rules of value in this world after they burned the one civilization that ever proved those rules were wrong. And then they kept writing them, generation after generation, quietly enough that nobody currently alive, including me, including every council official I've ever worked under, has any reason to suspect the formula is anything but neutral, sensible bureaucracy. It was Mira, practical as always even in the middle of a revelation this size, who finally steered the conversation toward the part that actually mattered for the days immediately ahead of them. If Frostspire's coming for So-yeon, she said, and this, she gestured at the archive around them, is who Frostspire actually is, underneath the discipline and the pretty ice, we should probably understand exactly what we're dealing with, all 6 of them, not just the one currently walking toward our gate. So-yeon, who'd gone quiet in a way that suggested she was still somewhere back in that granary with a first steward she'd never met, finally exhaled and pulled herself back to the present with visible effort. Fine, she said. You want the modern version? Here it is, unromantic as I can make it. Frostspire, she said, is what I grew up inside. Discipline, precision, control. That's the whole doctrine. And it's not a lie exactly. It's just never told you the discipline was built to make sure nothing like the compact ever caught a tower unprepared again. We produce the best retrieval and enforcement hunters on the continent. We're the most respected of the 6, publicly, and we earned that reputation the same way every respected institution earns one, by making sure the founding sin stayed buried under several centuries of genuinely excellent training programs.
Stormhold, Han offered, reading from the fragment again, broke the outer defense line. Still does exactly that for whoever pays them, So-Yen said. Thunder-aligned, the most openly aggressive of the 6. They don't do subtlety. They don't do patience. They do overwhelming force, and they do it fast. Half the private military contracts on this continent run through Stormhold in some form. If Ren wants backup that doesn't ask questions, that's where he'll go looking. Galewatch sold every weakness, Beck said, quieter now. And still does, So-Yen said. Wind-aligned, the information tower. Officially, scouts and couriers. Unofficially, the closest thing this continent has to a unified spy network, and the most politically embedded of all 6. Half the councilors and half the cities on this continent owe someone in Galewatch a favor they'd rather not discuss. If someone told Che exactly when and how to file that override, I'd start there. Cinder Peak burned it, Do-hyun said, feeling the word settle strangely in his mouth given what it now meant. Flame-aligned. The hammer, not the scalpel. They glorify destruction as cleansing. Genuinely, doctrinally, it's part of their founding creed. Loudest, proudest, least interested in subtlety of any of the 6. If Ashfall ever draws a large enough rift threat that the region can't ignore it, Cinder Peak is who gets sent to handle it. And handle with Cinder Peak has never once meant anything gentle. Umbral Reach found him unarmed, Han said, and didn't finish the sentence. Shadow-aligned, officially outlawed in most cities. Every tower publicly condemns them. Every single one of the other 5 quietly hires them the moment something needs doing that can't have a name attached to it. Nobody talks about Umbral Reach. That's rather the point of them. And Dawnspire wrote the version everyone still believes, Do-hyun said, last because he already suspected which one would hurt the most to hear out loud. Light-aligned. Healing, charity, public works. Genuinely, on the surface, the closest thing this world has to an institution people trust without reservation. They run half the free clinics on this continent. They also wrote, and have maintained for centuries, the exact philosophical doctrine that decided people like you don't count. The kindest face on the whole accord, and the one that did the most lasting damage, because nobody questions a doctrine when it comes wrapped in someone who just fed your children for free. She sat back, looking suddenly, thoroughly exhausted, in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. That's the 6-Tower Accord, Administrator. That's what actually runs this world, underneath the councils and the charters and the ration formulas. 6 houses who murdered a civilization for growing too fast in the wrong direction, wrote history to make sure nobody remembered it happened, and have spent every generation since making very sure it couldn't happen twice. And it's happening again anyway, Mira said quietly. Right here, under a garbage dump nobody was supposed to look at twice. Do-hyun stood at the archive's entrance a long while after the others had started packing up for the walk home, looking back down into the lantern-lit dark at a fragment of history that had spent centuries very carefully making sure nobody like him ever got this far again. System, he said quietly, one more time, testing the notification against everything he now understood it actually meant. Administrator class instances currently active worldwide. 1. Not rare, he thought. Targeted. And apparently important enough that 6 houses had once burned an entire civilization rather than let it keep growing.
which meant whatever was coming for Ashfall next wasn't going to be the last time this world decided he was a problem worth solving by force. He found he wasn't as frightened by that thought as he probably should have been. Ashfall didn't get its name from an accident, he said to Seo-yun, to Han, to whoever was still listening as they climbed back up into the ordinary evening noise of a city that had no idea what its own oldest secret was named. It got it from a fire, 6 towers lit on purpose, to make sure nothing like this ever grew back. He looked out over the district, smaller than the compact ever was, still mostly scrap and hard-won infrastructure, still very much a work in progress. I think it's time we made that name mean something else. Behind them, faint and distant, a gate guard's voice cut through the evening air, tight with the particular urgency of someone who'd just seen colors on the horizon they'd been specifically warned to watch for. "Tower robes on the North Road!" The shout carried down into the archive stairwell. "Gray and blue! They're not stopping at the gate. They're walking straight in." Do-hyun exchanged one long look with So-yun, watching 6 centuries of buried history rearrange itself, in real time, into the shape of the exact fight they were about to have. "Right," he said. "Let's go find out how much of that history Vice Master Ren actually knows he's part of." End of interlude.